So today I wanted to talk about these unspoken challenges. I think for a lot of us, the data kind of whispers to us and yells at us, and we get really excited and passionate about how do we use data to make better decisions, to improve the world, to make better products and better businesses, right? But doing this is actually hard. And increasingly, I feel like the how we work is as important as the what we work on, but we don't often discuss as much those challenges, those success stories, and share with each other how we actually accomplish doing our work. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So to start with, kind of what is success? So for the business, right, success of data science is really impact, right? It's improving the business. For the data scientist, I kind of put it as happiness, right? Do people feel impactful, empowered, productive, effective? Are they happy to do their jobs, and are they supported in doing their jobs? So we'll talk about what enables them to be successful. And this talk is really geared towards kind of a broad audience. On the one hand, people may be building data science teams, trying to establish data science teams, already building teams and having these challenges, and hopefully we can learn from each other, or data scientists entering the field and experiencing these challenges, right, firsthand. So I think the first thing to note is that this is a rapidly evolving field, data science, right? And there are many possible paths, and there are many ways to structure organizations, to work effectively inside of a business, to work effectively within teams. And there are a lot of common questions that come up and a lot of common challenges. And so I think it's helpful to actually address the fact that this is challenging and that this is evolving, and names are different, and terminologies are different, and technologies are rapidly evolving, so it's hard to catch up. What we'll spend the majority of today talking about is what you need to do to really invest to create what I like to call data science happiness, which is really boils down to talent, culture, process, and tools. And so we'll dig into some principles and examples of that. Before I get to that, I want to start by just kind of a few building blocks of what is a data scientist, because that comes up in making sure that you're actually set for success and happiness later. What skills do they have, right? What do we look for? And why is this actually hard? What causes these challenges that we have to overcome? So the way I like to oversimplify the term data scientist, because it means a lot of things to a lot of different people, is really thinking about it in kind of two main categories. Again, oversimplification, right? On the one hand, you have people who are really excited about creating deliverables where the end consumer is human, a product manager, an executive, a business partner, a stakeholder who is a human. You're creating data and insights to drive different decisions. And on the other hand, data scientists that are building data products, right? So production grade code that's actually being shipped and is it creating a data product, and that's the deliverable or the output. So that's kind of to simplify it. And it's important to think about this because if you are a data scientist, it could be that one or the other resonates for you, and you need to know what you're signing up for and getting yourself into. And if you're building a team, you need to understand what you're actually looking to create here. And if you don't do that well, that causes challenges down the line. To kind of flesh this out a little bit more, and I won't go into the details of all of this, but there are these kind of differences in deliverables, in key partners, in the core skills that are used, in timelines of projects. And so it's helpful to think about this framework, again, as you're either building a team or as you're entering a company. And one of the things that's also noteworthy here, right, is that, again, I'm oversimplifying. So what about data visualization experts or data engineers? And a data engineer in one company is very different than a data engineer at another company. So terminology is different, and that leads to confusion. And it's really important to actually clarify that. So let's talk about what skills do they have. The way I like to think about it roughly is kind of these 5 categories of what we look for. And this spans the majority of types of data scientists, if you will. Right, so we look for statistics and modeling, we look for programming, we look for analytical creativity, we look for product and business intuition, and communication and partnership. Right, so for analytics, you need to understand, to be curious, what can be done with the data? How can this be used? How can we make changes? For data products, you're probably going to need more production-grade coding than perhaps scripting languages that you can be doing for advanced analytics. For business and product intuition, you can build great products and do great things with data, but if you don't have the intuition of, is this meaningful, important, impactful, going to help your customers or clients, right, or bottom line, that's not going to be impactful for the business. And so all of these different characteristics come in. Now, one of the bottom lines is also these people are unicorns, right? It's really hard to find people that are good at all of these things and probably more that I've left out. And so this is challenging. So you don't want to lower the bar, you want to continuously look for these people, but increasingly as teams are growing and scaling, as more and more companies are starting to hire for data science, it actually gets hard. And so you have to think about how do we hire, where do we hire them from, and how do we create teams that complement each other. So let's talk a little bit about why is this role hard. So first of all, by definition, it's cross-functional, right? In having these skills and in doing these kinds of roles, you're going to be working with a variety of different people. For example, at LinkedIn, data scientists are working with product managers and executives and designers and marketing and business operations and legal and security and finance. It's a lot of different stakeholders with a lot of different needs, points of view, perspectives, timelines, priorities. And so doing this work and figuring out how to make your work effective is actually a really hard problem. And many job functions are cross-functional, but data science definitely is one of those. And so that becomes a challenge. It's also a mix of very technical, right, and very business focused. And so finding people that are really good at both of those, or being good at both of those yourself, is challenging, right? And you have to help people who aren't strong in one get stronger. You need to balance this tension between speed and scientific rigor, right? So on the one hand, you have this tension of data scientists sort of want to do something right and deep and rigorous, but that takes time, and you need to be able to stomach that. And maybe you can't stomach that. Then you need to be able to explain that to the data scientists so that they don't get frustrated, right? So this tension is a constant tension that exists within data science teams and the businesses that they support. It also includes the word science, right? So in science, in basic science, you invest in things that sometimes don't pan out. In academics, there's a sort of support system for that. There's a mechanism by which we say, we'll invest, we'll try, some things won't pan out. That's more difficult in business when you don't have a clear ROI or even a clear timeline of what you're actually investing in. Not all data science projects are like that, but some are. And finally, it requires, and I think this is an underestimated piece that's definitely learning, is that it requires an investment in really strong foundations and thoughtful data culture that has to be championed at the highest levels in an organization. If you don't have this culture of data science, of knowing what to do with it, and why to do it, and how to do it, it's going to be very difficult to build great data science teams and to retain them. So kind of in talking to a lot of different companies and seeing kind of the field mature, I think that there's a typical path that evolves within data science teams. And so if you think about the business phase, when the business is still small and you're kind of trying to find the product market fit, the data science team, first of all, often is a little bit behind. So typically kind of the product or the team is evolving, and sort of then you start hiring a data science team or an analyst or two, or trying to figure out what you should do with data. So you're a little bit behind, you're a little bit playing catch up as a data science team. The team is small, there's tons of incoming requests flying all over the place, there's no clear prioritization, and that's hard. And as the business phase evolves, where you have a product market fit, then the data science team needs to start evolving and going beyond kind of the basics to help accelerate, right, and help the business. Typically, the data phase here is you have a realization that it actually needs some structure and that you need to have tools in place to be able to do good data science. And so you start figuring out, okay, well, we've seen this a couple of times, we know what we need to invest in, what are the basics that we need to create. You build systems that enable that and support that. You create self-serve data to democratize the data so that some of the lower level tasks aren't being repeated by the data science team, and they're focusing on more proactive and innovative things. And finally, the business is more mature and you sort of get to a good place where you're both balancing a good combination of types of projects. You have a good reputation with your business partners, and you're really more vocal about what you need to succeed, and there's a good relationship there. But this is a common evolution, and as you're in these earlier phases, right, how we work is hard. It's actually hard to do this, and you run into challenges. And so what I want to do now is start diving into the team talent culture process and tools to think about what in each of those categories are some principles, and give you some specific examples that we've found have really helped us at LinkedIn to establish this. So we'll go over the team talent and how you create a team talent that really complements one another and enables growth and learning. A culture that values data and data scientists. A process for how to work together, who's responsible for what are some expected timelines, and tools that will enable data quality and efficiency and effectiveness of the data scientists. So starting with talent. One of the things that's really important is to actually set these clear expectations on what kind of job are you hiring a data scientist to do, right? What am I here to do? Which kind of data scientist am I, and does that resonate? And sometimes in a smaller company, you're going to have a data scientist that spans these spectrums, and that's fine. But being explicit about it is actually important. And more often than not, you have companies where that isn't explicit, and then it leads to frustration, mismatched expectations, and people potentially leaving your organization. And so being clear on what the status is really important. Sometimes it's actually also helpful to say, hey, initially you're going to invest in foundations, and over time you're going to move over to creating data products, to doing innovation. But you actually have to be really thoughtful and explicit about that. Another aspect is, what's the state of the data? So I've interviewed data scientists who have gone, left a startup, started a startup, got to the startup, and there's no data. And they're like, what am I supposed to do? I'm a data scientist. There's no data here for me. So, right, you can either help create the data that you want to see and use, right, and be part of that foundation, right, or you can leave, right? And so you want to be mindful of that in advance and hire data scientists at the right time and hire data scientists that will help you actually create the data that you need. Another aspect is, can you as an organization take time for learning? Meaning, at what stage are you in the evolution of your business or your company? Right, so if you think about sort of a portfolio of investment for any business, it's not necessarily for data science, typically you're going to have some amount of investment in sort of things that are core, that are basic foundational, then you have some strategic, and then you have some venture innovation. Different companies will have different portfolios in terms of, right, is this a 70-20-10 split, is it something else? But you kind of want to have investments in all areas. The challenge is, again, if data science is sort of catching up to the rest of the business, often reality looks more like this. And then you're doing a lot of groundwork, and the team is doing very little of the top, like 5-point font that I have there on venture, right? Innovation. And that can get really frustrating for the team. So again, you have to think about from a motivational perspective, and also from the team being able to have really step function impacts on the business, how do you manage a portfolio of investments where you're even letting some of the core things wait for some time, and creating that understanding and expectation with business partners so that you have time to enable the team, motivate the team, and do some amount of strategic and venture. And again, that really requires these relationships to be created between the data science team and the rest of the business to trust that we're doing the right thing for the long run. Another aspect of talent in data science teams is these people are unicorns, right? So you have to create these diverse teams that complement each other. When you have one data scientist, hopefully they're really good at everything. But when you have larger teams, suddenly you'll have somebody who's amazing technical strength. They can do a majority of the project, but that last final bit of communicating the results and what is the data telling us, whether it's creating a beautiful PowerPoint deck or really eliciting the actionable insights from the data, or shipping that final data product in a way that actually fits the UI of what you're trying to accomplish, these final pieces might need augmentation by another member of the team. And so thinking about how you set up the team and projects to enable that is important. So some examples of how to do that are create ways for them to teach each other, right? So you can pair people in projects or parts of projects. You can have communication mentoring, even bring somebody external, right? If you have a data science team who's great but not effective because they can't do that final piece of working with business partners, bring in a communication coach and give them lessons on how to do that, right? So be creative about how you augment the gaps in training data science teams. Letting people shadow each other as they do projects is another way that we've used. And finally, simple things, right? Like setting up lunches so that people, if you have embedded data scientists in different parts of the organization, create unison by having them learn from each other, and so that they can actually then be the people that are bringing back to different lines of business learnings, shared techniques, shared methodologies, etc. And finally, keep them happy by enabling them to be productive. So I think more often than not, data scientists will be frustrated by something, but they're not actually speaking up, hence the microphone, right? So it's really important to speak up, right? Say what's the problem? What's the pain point? What's the fix? Is it process? Is it people? Is it tools? Is it relationships with business partners, right? What are the challenges here that have to be overcome, right? And so really speaking up and feeling empowered to speak up is important to help create a great team. Finally, learn from others, right? So data science meetups or coming to Strata, right? All of us sharing each other's tips and tricks for how to actually do this work effectively is another way that you can do this. So talk about it internally and talk about it externally. So moving on to culture. I would categorize the data culture as important from two aspects. A culture that values data data in and of itself, and a culture that values the data scientists, right, so that they feel impactful and productive. So on the data side, this is around things like data quality. Is the company investing in creating great data? Right? If you have a bunch of employees whose entire job is to use the data, right? This is all of what they do. Then do you have data that's at a high enough quality that they can do their work well? And if not, what's needed? Right? Data ethics. Are we using data ethically, internally and externally, and with integrity? So for example, one of the things that is more frustrating than anything to data scientists is where they're asked to do a certain thing only to support the hypothesis that a business leader has, which is then discarded if that hypothesis doesn't prove true, right? So having integrity about how we're using the data, right, whatever it's saying to us, is really important, and ensuring that there's a culture that has that. Investing in the right metrics and models. So here's an example from LinkedIn. In the earlier days, we were focusing a lot on quantity. So, how many things do we have people doing, right? How many invitations are being sent? How many signups do we have, right? How many connections are being made? And over time, you realize that actually the right way to think about this is what's the value that we're delivering to our members, right? If we have a certain type of experience that we want to enable our members to do to be more productive and successful at their role, how do we actually quantify that with metrics and make sure that the teams are driving towards those kinds of metrics? This is from a cultural standpoint of what we're trying to achieve. And so we actually did a large investment in making up member value metrics. That's actually what we call the member value metrics. The idea being making sure that we're actually measuring ourselves against value created for our members. So that's just one example of, that takes time and investment. It takes a fair bit of time to design the right metrics, to socialize them, to get them established and bought in, to execute against them. But it's really valuable because it creates a culture of proper data usage. And finally, data access. Investing in data access for the business users as well as for the data scientists is really important in creating a data culture that people have at their fingertips the access to the right data. It enables them to do more and more of data usage and create data culture. And finally, valuing data scientists themselves. So again, people are not going to be happy and excited to do work at your organization if they don't feel valued, if they don't feel that the work they're doing has impact. If it's a nice to have, but not an integral part of the business, that's not as exciting, right? And so one of the important aspects is, are they leading necessary partners? Do they have a seat at the table? Is that the expectation? Or are they sort of a lagging service provider that doesn't really get context or ownership? And is their work materializing? So here's some examples of this, right? Ask yourself, who are the leaders, right? If there's a cross-functional kind of kickoff of a meeting, is this product and engineering or product engineering and design? Is the data scientist needed there from the get-go and through all the phases of a project? Right. Another aspect is who's responsible for caring about the metrics. So you might think, well, the data scientist, but actually no. Right? The data scientists might be developing metrics and monitoring them and understanding them deeply and caring about them, but they already care about them. To develop data culture, you actually need the business leaders to own and care about their metrics. So again, as an example, in the earlier days of LinkedIn, we would have these weekly meetings where the data scientists would get together and review metrics and performance. The problem with that is, where are the business leaders here, right? They need to be owning and understanding and driving these metrics and actually be speaking to them. And they're also the ones that are launching things that are affecting these metrics and actually have some sense of what's happening to these metrics and why. And so creating that ownership from a cultural standpoint was really important. Another aspect is, if you think about the previous talk talked about, we have data producers, right? Let's say app developers or engineers in our case, who are instrumenting logging or tracking into our products. That then flows through the system and goes to the data consumers, right? The data scientists. Well, if the app developers are really excited to create these amazing features for members, but they don't really know to care about actually the logging and the tracking that the rest of these employees and ecosystem feeds off of, that's a cultural aspect. You have to teach them and train them and get them as excited about developing measurement and tracking and logging as in developing features, right? And that's not necessarily easy to do because that's not what they're trained to do necessarily. And so, for example, at LinkedIn, we established this culture of logging is as important as feature development. So if you are shipping a great product, you need to be able to measure it, right? If you can't measure it, you can't fix it. And so you need to be able to measure it, and you can't actually ship before you've done that. And this concept, right, it's a process or a rule, but it's actually a cultural process to make sure that data is as valued as the features that we're shipping to our members. And finally, there are other examples, like, again, at a time where we felt like there wasn't this understanding of data excellence and data craftsmanship, create initiatives around it, right? And market it and drive. And this is one of the examples that we did last year. Have a huge initiative just around data craftsmanship. We were highlighting examples and did a number of other events to really promote data craftsmanship. And finally, creating a data boot camp for partners. And I'll talk about that more later. So on the process side, one of the things that we did early on is realize that we have to figure out what is the plan and how do we guide the company on the plan of how we work with partners. So the team was experiencing a lot of frustrations. For example, a product would launch and it didn't have tracking and measurement. Or the success metrics that were being launched with certain hypotheses-driven testing weren't the right success metrics to be optimizing for. So teams would come to us and say, hey, we're launching this thing tomorrow. Can you validate the tracking for us? Like, no, it doesn't take half a day to validate tracking. So there were a lot of frustrations, really because there wasn't a process for data-driven product development. And so the point was basically, let's create one. Let's educate the teams and get everyone in the same room and really educate them on what do we need to do this right? Right? To just alleviate these frustrations and make sure that everyone's on the same page of how do you do this process? How do you work with data scientists? And so I won't go into the details of this, but we literally created this sort of feature launch plan, going from the PM, so the red here denotes who's responsible for what phase of the process, and we actually also give time estimates so people can understand, you can't do this cycle in a week. It's not going to happen, right? So don't expect data scientists to burn the midnight oil so that you can launch this, if you haven't come to us earlier. We actually have to set that expectation. And so the metaphor here is kind of like you're building a house, right? So you have to create the vision for the house. You have to decide how you're going to measure that this house is successful. You create the blueprints. You create the building blocks. You ensure that the foundations are solid. Right? In our case, we do a lot of online experimentation, and so we have to make sure that that's set up correctly. We put these building blocks together, and then finally you have a house that everyone's proud to ship. Right? But this is a process. And so, again, the point here is just to say that we created a process that everyone understands and have these expected timelines. Another aspect is that we really realized that we need to have a better process for how do we review data and how do we agree on what is it telling us, right, so that everyone is on the same page. So examples here are, for example, we'll have weekly metric review meetings where we review our metrics, and these are all stakeholders, business stakeholders, so product managers, executives, the data science team, business operations team, where we're holding these reviews so that we can review performance together, review experiment results together, and actually make trade-offs in a very principled way when we're weighing what we're going to do and how we're going to evolve the business. Another aspect that we took on was how do we train the organization to be data-driven? So we realized that we want people to know how to work with us well, and we want people to be data-driven, right? But that's on us. We need to actually help people understand how to use data. And so we created data boot camps, which are mandatory, for example, for every PM that's entering LinkedIn, and other stakeholders increasingly are also joining it and asking to join it, where we talk to them about what is the end-to-end data pipeline from data producers to transport to consumers. What is tracking, and how do you actually define great tracking? And how does that have to fit in with the rest of the LinkedIn ecosystem? How do you think about metrics? How do you define success metrics and do hypothesis-driven product development? How do you do experiments? How do you set them up? How do you analyze them? Not that they're going to necessarily do that, but they need to understand the workflow and the considerations and the timeline and the complexity so that we can all do this together in a great way. And even how to work with us, right? For example, reviewing that launch plan. Another thing that we established to this end was a data model review committee. So basically the idea here was we were realizing that different teams were, as the company was evolving, different teams were launching different products, and so it's great that you have an ability to launch data, new logging for data, but then these things weren't fitting in well together. So one product team was launching something that didn't fit in well with another product team, and then doing joins on this data was not possible. And so it created a committee to basically review this, a committee of cross-functional leads from different product areas and different business areas to say, anytime you want to ship a new data model, does this actually pass our review? What are the considerations you need to take? And then in terms of, this is a really important one, making people aware of each other. So on the one hand, when you get to streaming technologies, you can have a case where basically producers are shipping data and not really worrying about how they're going to be consumed. But that's actually a problem because you're only kind of shipping data so that people can consume it. So how they're going to consume it is actually important, and you need to get these people talking to each other so that you're doing things in the best way. And so kind of the idea here is really create the data, let the data science team help create the data that they want to be seeing and using. And this is a very proactive and very empowering concept typically. Rather than feel like you're a victim of the data, right, where you have kind of the data producers or the app developers kind of throwing data over the wall and saying, okay, consumers, now go use it. We don't really know how or care how. You can probably just figure it out and use it. And then these people are frustrated and saying, like, we can't use it because you can't join it together, or it doesn't actually mean the same thing. You've changed the semantics on us without letting us know, right? And having all these frustrations. Instead, you really have to think about it as, you as an app developer or a product manager actually have to own the artifact that's feeding the rest of this ecosystem, this data ecosystem, including the employees within the same room, right, virtually, that are actually using this data and making their livelihood of using this data to make, your business or product better. And so to kind of go from, victims of the data to really having this data science happiness, what we realize is we really have to have these people in the same room and have very proactive partnership on developing joint requirements. And so what we did is institute a very clear process for development. Specifically here, this is talking about tracking and logging, where we basically say we have certain expectations. So in this case, the PM is responsible for bringing the mock of a feature that they're thinking about. What's the hypothesis? What are the goals? What are the data requirements? What's a proposal for success metrics and tracking? Then the data scientist will review that and typically augment that with things that were missed or other considerations. The PM is responsible for actually having this source of truth document constantly updated. They review that together with an engineer, and finally, implementation happens, and there's a few other steps along the way. But the idea here is really to have a very clear process to get it right, where you're actually making sure that everyone's getting in the same room and all considerations from both sides are being met. And finally, how do we prioritize our work? So very briefly, right, one of the aspects here is you want to have this really healthy mix, an increasingly healthy mix of proactive and reactive, right? And so you want to have a planning cycle that blends both things that are initiated by the data science team and things that are initiated by the business. And typically, as the company is maturing and as the data science team is growing, and as you're investing in infrastructure and technology and tools, you can get better and better at this and kind of shift the pyramid to kind of a healthy portfolio. So moving on to tools, you really need, there's a lot of goodwill and greatness in process and in culture, but often, right, you need tooling to help this. So you have to utilize tooling to make it really hard to get things wrong, right, and really easy to get things right. So basically, kind of the motto is, in an ideal case, like, always be tooling. If anything can be automated or tooled to help people do the right thing, especially as a company is rapidly growing and more people are coming in that aren't aware of kind of previous considerations, make it hard to get things wrong, right? And you also need to raise awareness to these pain points, right? So what is hard today, and why is it hard, and what can fix it, and who can help fix it? And often that's a matter of actually getting resources and funding from an engineering team, let's say, to go build tooling. But typically the data science team is responsible for actually raising awareness of these problems rather than kind of sitting in within themselves and kind of being frustrated at things but not changing it. So you have to affect that change yourself. So if we go over kind of 3 example areas, one aspect is creating sustainable data quality. So here, again, we talked about, there's this great process that we've created. We're getting people in a room. They're all talking together. The data producers are doing what the data consumers are asking them, right? Great. So that was the plan, but is that actually manifesting, and is that reality, right? So ideally, you create something that enables that via tooling. So in our case, what we did is something that was very seemingly should be simple was really hard and frustrating in the early days of LinkedIn. Doing something as simple as page flow analysis. When people come to LinkedIn, what are they doing next? And after then, what are they doing next? What are they clicking on? Where are they going? Right? Why was that hard? Well, because as the company evolved, different teams were creating each of those pages. They're calling it different things. They're tracking it in a different way. And it just really became hard. And it shouldn't be, right? It should be super simple to do something like that. And so at one point in time, we said kind of enough is enough. Let's invest in standardizing core data entities and terminology and put kind of framework level tracking in place for anything like pages, clicks, navigation from one page to another, impressions, and actions. So again, anything that can be done simply, right, and automated should be. And basically now, as long as you've named something, we have it in a very standardized way. But another aspect of that was, that plan that the PM and the data scientist and the engineer came up with, well, you have to put that into something that's a living, breathing document that can also be monitored and send alerts when things aren't being adhered to. And so for that, we created an internal tool or an app which basically has the specifications written into them that the product manager, engineer, and data scientist came up with. And then anything that's not adhering to those rules in production fires alerts at the right people to make sure that we're actually catching that. Right? So developing tools to enable that source of truth document to not just be a wiki page or a Google Doc, but actually code was really important. And then finally, and I'll talk a lot more about this in the talk that we're doing tomorrow, we created another aspect, which is really a new technology that we call Dolly Views, that's really sort of a data API that enables basically a contract to be bound between the producers and the consumers in a very rigorous way. But again, kind of one of the learnings here is really speak up, right? Speak up in terms of what is a problem that probably can be solved with tooling that maybe just hasn't been prioritized because you haven't spoken up enough. Another aspect that we tackled at LinkedIn over the past few years was we realized that there was lack of trust. There was lack of trust in data. And why was this? Well, as LinkedIn had evolved internally, there were a lot of different tools being used for a lot of different purposes. So some people were writing, let's say, metric scripts on Hadoop, and some people were using Teradata, and some dashboards were visualized in MicroStrategy or Tableau or other tools, and it was kind of all over the place. And so you had basically the same metric or data saying very different things, right? You had discrepant data. And that really caused lack of trust, right? And how does somebody know what to use and how to use it? And so we realized we have to standardize at least that. We have to create what we call a unified metric pipeline, which is a platform, which is a platform that we have internally that now has kind of a single source of golden truth for data sets and for metrics, where everyone can use that. And that is efficient because it empowers partners to self-serve data. And it enables scaling data science resources. So once you've invested, you have one person and one team investing in one metric or data set, nobody else does that. You can discover these data sets and reuse them. And that was really important, again, for the kind of happiness of the data science team, to not be scrambling around with fire drills around why does this data not match that data, and trying to figure out who did what. And also not to be having lack of productivity because you have duplicate efforts to do the same thing. And so for us, this unified metric pipeline feeds off our experimentation platform. It feeds into our visualization and dashboarding tool that we've developed internally, and it enables ad hoc querying and sort of data exploration. And so this one source of truth was really important to create the tooling for. And finally, to enable data-driven decision-making. Again, at LinkedIn internally, almost everything we do is an online experiment with our users, where we'll ship something to a small set of users and do it as an experiment and see, is that better or worse for them? And so for us, a really foundational aspect of this was actually having one platform where all of our success metrics, all of our company level KPIs in a tiered fashion appear. So we can actually make very data-driven decisions, understanding when one small change in one piece of the ecosystem or the product, how does that affect every single other metric and business line that anybody else cares about? And so we do that by having one shared experimentation platform. All of the metrics are there, hundreds of metrics there. They're tiered in terms of importance. And that actually facilitates, this tool facilitates us to make decisions, right? To get in a room when we're impacting metrics that it's not clear how to make the call, and have a process by which we make the call in terms of, is this something that is better or worse for our members or clients? So finally, kind of to wrap up, no one said data science is easy. But you really need to invest in the team talent, in the culture, and the process and tools to enable data science happiness. Right? Create teams that complement each other, a culture that values both data and data scientists, a process for how to work together so that it's clear who's responsible for what kind of work takes what kind of amount of time, and how do you create great relationships within the teams. And then finally, tools to help with all of this. So kind of recognize that this is a very rapidly evolving field and it's not easy for anybody, and then invest in these areas. If you have any more questions, we can take them now or at office hours. We'll be diving into a lot more of the technical details of some of the things that we've built tomorrow at this talk. We're, of course, always hiring. And one final plug for you is that we today have just announced the Economic Graph research project, and so you can check out more details here. Thank you. Great, we have time for a few questions. Yes.
So for unified platform, did you use data, like common data model, or what did you use?
So the question was, for the unified metrics pipeline, what did we use? So this is an internally built tool. So typically we have actually code that's written in Pig that we then productionalize and have meet a certain SLA. and that gets piped into all of our different platforms. So it's not in Tableau. The visualization aspect of the data is Raptor, which is also another internal tool that we've developed, and over time will.
For the business concepts and how they connected, what do you use, like correlation structure?
What do you?
Not for the data pipeline, but for your like common data model, so you don't duplicate. I mean, the user is a user. It's not like some other.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so that, for example, a user, so we have common, basically kind of terminology. So for us, a user has a member ID, and that has common terminology. We have common headers that are shared across teams. And some of the aspects of that is actually what the Data Model Review Committee and the training that we have helps to make sure that people are utilizing common patterns. And then we have tools that enable discoverability of these so that we're implementing them in a repeatable way and not duplicating efforts. Yeah. Yes? A process in terms of like what our hiring pipeline looks like? Yeah, so the question is around what's a good process for hiring data scientists. So again, different companies have different kind of perspectives on this. For us, for example, what we do is we have 2 phone screens typically. So we have a case study kind of that we go through on a phone screen where we'll do kind of product sense and experimentation, say for analytics. It's a little bit different for the machine learning. We'll do a coding screen as the second round typically. And then we'll have an on-site where we'll have many different aspects of this covered and assessed. So of what I showed, kind of the 5 different categories that we look for. That's our typical process. Other companies do case studies where you're sitting in the room for 6 hours and you actually have a laptop and you can do sort of a case study. You get real data and you, at the end of it, have to present what you've found. Other companies have take-home assignments where you get real data, you kind of have some time for it and do it. There's pros and cons to all of those. So for example, for the take-home assignments, with great candidates that have a lot of different companies that they're looking at, they might drop off, right? They might not want to actually invest in doing this homework assignment. And so that's another consideration to take. But one of the things I would say is expand where you're looking for these data scientists, because as this field is evolving, don't just look for example, computer science graduates, right? Look much more broadly. Look at the sciences and start broadening out sort of how you look for candidates rather than the sort of typical pipeline of data science candidates. Okay.
I like the idea of giving data ownership to like the PMs, the UI engineers, and so forth. But I've always found a certain pattern that's interesting, which is that many companies are more engineers than they're data scientists. So having the data scientists involved in the business element, higher up in the chain, really stretches the data science.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, how did you get around to?
Yeah, it's a great question. So kind of data scientists are often far outnumbered from engineers. And so how, having a process where you're mandating having a data scientist early in the process for any launch is a problem because you're going to bottleneck things. You don't have enough of you to do that, right? So kind of a couple of aspects. One is make sure that the high priority kind of products or initiatives are the ones that you think are going to be highly complex. You kind of have somebody in there. That's one aspect of prioritizing it. And the other one is really what we've done is this, okay, we realized like how do we scale ourselves? We can't be involved in anything. So these data boot camps and office hours and trainings and videos and things like that have really helped with that because people at least have something to go to. Like often they want to do the right thing, but they don't know what that right thing is. So making it as clear and explicit through trainings and through videos and through PowerPoint decks and through wiki pages has helped a lot of that. And then also this data model review committee. So at some point the data model review committee moved from being more of us, sort of the data consumers, to actually being the data producers. And by and large now it's more the data producers that really care about this, that are actually passionate about kind of doing the right thing with data. And so they're serving on this committee and basically kind of helping us with that rather than it having to only be us as the data consumers. So that's another way where they're catching a lot of problems earlier on, kind of in the pipeline, and not needing us. But it's a good question. It's a challenge. Yeah. Yes. Or sorry. Somebody who hasn't asked yet. Yeah.
My question is, as an academic, so I'm a professor at the University of Southern California, and there's always a gap between what you teach in school, data science program, and what you guys do in the company. So what's your suggestion here for academics to minimize this gap?
Yeah.
So you can get better quality
students, yeah. So the question is kind of, there's always a gap from what you learn in school in data science to what you need on the job in industry, and so what can we do with that? So one of the things is internships. I think internships, you know, as you're doing your degree, really help because it helps you understand, you know, what kind of data science role do you want and what skills do you need, so that the end of your training you can actually kind of beef up on those skills. So that's one aspect. I think we've seen that internships are really successful both for the candidates kind of and for the companies in terms of you know, doing a good job of sort of having these people come in. Another aspect is I think some of the softer skills are actually something that's really needed, that I think there's a gap in training. So for example, you know, especially for students, let's say doing a PhD, often when you're doing a PhD, you don't actually have to do a lot of collaboration. You don't have very specific timelines, right? You don't have a need to prioritize a lot of moving parts, and that's a lot of what you have to do in data science roles. Work very cross-functionally, constantly prioritize and reprioritize, push back. So actually the softer skills, I think there are ways that training programs can augment by doing, for example, training on these aspects to help people when they come in be able to do this better. Because I think the technical skills are actually often there for sure, but the softer skills are often what makes it more challenging to kind of come into these roles. Yes.
Can you give an example of content for the data bootcamp? I mean, is it more like R, Python, or it's like more like collaboration?
Yeah.
Selling your tools? Or...
Yeah, so the question is in the bootcamp, like what do we cover? So it's not R or Python, sometimes it's SQL. It kind of depends if we're talking about a 2-hour bootcamp or a full day bootcamp. But basically we go through things like we show pictures of our end-to-end data pipeline. So both the pipeline, how data flows at LinkedIn, and then also the teams that are involved, so people actually know, you know, who's involved and what it takes to make this happen, so that they're not only aware of themselves very far upstream, but are aware of the whole end-to-end. We go through our tools, so how do you self-serve data, how do you visualize data, what are some kind of gotchas, how do you set up an experiment correctly, and how is it going to be analyzed correctly, and then sort of some process stuff like how to work with the data science team, you know, going through this launch plan. So those are kind of the broad categories. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the question is how does a data science and data engineering team work together? So both teams have evolved a lot over the years, so it kind of depends at what phase you're talking about. So for example, today, one of the things that we did is we said, let's move away from a process by which we have a lot of ETL work, where sort of the data science team is defining certain metrics, and then they hand it off to a centralized ETL team to go, you know, productionize that without context often. We've moved away from that, where the data scientists are responsible for that. And part of that was because the data engineering team was bottlenecking. There weren't enough to be able to do this work. And partly is they didn't have the context for what the business needed, and so there were often misalignments on what the output was, right? So you can give clear requirements, but if that changes, things would break. And so that's one aspect that we actually took most of that work away from expecting that to be done from the data engineering team. The data engineering team does, for example, focus a lot on developing this platform. So the unified metric platform, all of the creation of that and the SLAs on that and the process at which we do review boards with them, all of that is something that we partner closely with them and they own and build. Yeah, those are some examples. Yeah. Yep.
As you mentioned, very likely that the business team is a mixture of people with different backgrounds, right? How do you make sure that these people can carry out the business project in a very standardized way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So data scientists are often very different and different from each other, and so how do you create a process by which there's some kind of standardization of the process of doing the data science work? So there, honestly, a lot of that is actually through kind of simple things, like, for example, creating template wikis. So let's take an example, kind of experiment design or a deep dive analysis. In the early days, kind of everyone was doing it kind of whatever way they saw fit, right? But then you start to see some patterns emerged of like, here's a good way to do it, here are the phases, and here's a good way to actually write it up, and here's a good way to communicate it. So we took from some of those good examples and created kind of templates, right? So for example, a wiki page or a Google Doc, and said kind of, here's the expectation, you know, when you're doing this, you don't need to stick to that very, you know, strictly. But it's a really good way to basically get the team to start standardizing how they do things. And then in terms of methodologies, right, then you have to have things set up like, you know, shared learnings or critiques, or bringing it into group meetings so that you're kind of critiquing the work and making sure that there's analytical rigor and everything, and that you're kind of standardizing from a methodology perspective. Yep. Yes. Yeah.
And even if you take something really technical and you try to train them, you may not get there. So have you used data science like project managers or people that could sit more in that space between the business users and more sort of hardcore like people that like to go to
Yeah.
like what
Yeah.
do you do with those people that are kind of in the middle?
Yeah.
How do you use those people most effectively? And would you call them data scientists or call them something else?
Yeah. So the question is kind of doing the whole thing end to end is hard. It's hard to find somebody that can do that, really well. And so, have we thought about things like having data science project managers, and then what if we have that? What do we call them? And so, we don't have data science project managers. I think what we do is when some people are better at and like that piece of, so if we kind of think of a data science project from like figuring out what the problem is and what the questions are, which requires business and then requires sort of the data science analytical aspects of it, and then doing the actual work, right? And then communicating the results or kind of shipping the final piece of it, definitely different skills along the way. And so sometimes you have somebody who's great at the whole thing, and that's great. Sometimes you have somebody who's great at the middle piece, but kind of not at the first part or the last part. So there, I think the best way is basically to partner them with somebody who does that really well. We don't have people that just do that role, that just do that project management piece, because what we found is if we have these sort of translation layers, context gets lost, ownership is lost, satisfaction of doing and delivering the work gets lost. So you have to actually make this, a team or a trio. So for example, we might have cases where we have, like, let's say the business context coming from executive or a product manager. You have the data scientist tasked with doing the work. You'll have a more senior data scientist tasked with basically ensuring that that data scientist is really successful and productive, right? But still gets the ownership and the context and the credit and is part of the whole process so that they learn. So we don't separate those roles out, because what we found is if we ever kind of did that or inadvertently did that, things were lost in translation, and just it wasn't as effective as having that person really have full ownership end to end. I think that data science project management is an interesting area. I think it's actually an area, and product managers, honestly, it's an area that we need to start exploring more. There isn't a good, I think, kind of pattern for that yet that I've seen. And there are definitely some challenges and pros and cons that arise with having that, which is probably why we haven't, and many of us I think haven't kind of put that in place yet. Yeah. Anyone else?
The ratio, what is the ratio of data science and data engineers?
I can't actually tell you the exact numbers, not because I don't want to, because I don't know. But again, I think data engineering, the question is, what do you mean by data engineering? Because people use it very differently. Yeah. I think there's like 5 different definitions for what people mean when they say data engineering. So I'd love to know more about what you mean to be able to answer well.